Our next session is about to begin within 10 minutes. It's basically about a book that is about children's fiction. The Good Children is the name of the book. And we would have Miss Roopa Farooki and Saman Shamsie as the speakers for our session.
Hi there. It is so lovely to be here to talk about children's writing at this event, with, especially with Saman. We're both published by Oxford University Press, myself in the UK and Saman here in Pakistan. And we don't have a moderator. This is more of an in-conversation. But we thought we might start off by introducing ourselves. Sure, so I can start. Can everyone hear me fine?
Now I'm very loud. Okay, so I'm Saman Shamsie. I'm a school teacher. I teach at Karachi Grammar School. I've been teaching for a while now. I started off as a ceramic artist and then moved to teaching in 2002. Started off with O-level physics. And now I'm a primary teacher since 2014. Still at the grammar school in Karachi. I've written 3 stories. And they started about, I can just hold them up. The first one was The Adventures of Slothful Slough-Off in 2010. And then The Magical Woods came out in 2014. And after a bit of a break, I came out with a sort of a short novel called Where the Rivers Meet. And, well, that's basically me. So I'll move on to Roopa, whose career trajectory is even more interesting than moving from ceramics to teaching.
Like Saman, I have had different careers. I'm Dr. Roopa Farooki now. I've been an NHS doctor in the UK for the last few years, starting rather unluckily with the pandemic. I'm now an internal medicine specialist and will be subspecialising to registrar later next year. Before that, I was a writer of literary fiction. I've written 6 literary novels, and my 7th, which has just come out recently, which I'm also doing a panel about, is a memoir of working in the early days of the pandemic as a junior doctor. And before that, and I still do this as well, I'm also a lecturer. I lecture at the University of Oxford in the Creative Writing Masters and Literature degree. So we've all done slightly different things, so it's a different journey actually for both of us for coming into writing. And we thought we might structure this by talking a little bit about our individual journeys into writing and then into children's fiction. I think we both have this kind of creative urge, and it's how we kind of focus down into wanting to create these books for children. So I'm going to ask Saman to start talking about her journey.
Yes, so I started off thinking I had no interest in writing. My sister, Kamala Shamsie, of course, is a writer. My mother here is also a writer and sort of a literary critic. And it was not because of them that I started writing. It actually started in school. So I was teaching, like I said, physics. A lot of people thought I should be teaching art because I was a ceramic artist. But the art teacher at grammar school told me that I think you should write a children's story. And I was like, why would I do that? And she said, because it's the way you talk. She said, I find it very lyrical. You never say, have a brownie. You say, have an ooey gooey brownie. And, you know, so you could write a story about a little mouse that runs around and says, give me a bell on my cell. And I thought it was just a silly conversation we were having, and we were laughing about it. And then I went home and I said to my sister, I'm going to write a story. And she said, then gave me a notebook and pencil. And she said, the only way to start a story is start writing. And I'm like, I don't know who to write about. So I thought of my friend and I said, okay, maybe not a mouse, but maybe a snake. And that's how the story of sort of Slothful Slough-Off came along. I had been watching the X-Files and I saw this man's skin slough off. And I said, oh, that's a nice name for a snake. So I started with a character, a snake, and then I started questioning, you know, who is this snake and how does he make friends? Is he a friendly snake? And then the story just emerged from there. So I started off with that, wrote for children with no idea what children's literature really was. And then when I was teaching in the primary school, I read a lot of children's literature because the librarian used to give me books and say, you know, read this book and sell it to your children so they come and borrow it from the library. And so that's how my writing style actually changed a lot. In the last book, it's very different because by the time I wrote this, I was a primary school teacher. So my journey into writing has been quite, it's been a process of learning and discovery. Rupa, how about you?
Well, I think in terms of writing, I always felt that I was a writer. Even when I was tiny, I was writing poems and short stories. And I mean, maybe it's just because my family were all very much into literature. My dad was, I was born here in Lahore, and my dad was from here. And his dream was to become a really celebrated writer. And he did publish a few, you know, quite good books, if I say so myself. But I always wanted to do that. So, you know, my favorite books were the really long, winding stories like Tolkien, where you could create a whole world. And one of the early books that I wrote, actually, for myself, was about the land of Apor Ikuraf, which is my name backwards, where I created a whole history, a whole population, ceremonies, traditions. I created a geography for this place. And so I always felt that I would be a writer. I didn't think it was something that you could do professionally, really. So my journey into being a professional published writer took a little while longer. You know, I did a degree and I did a proper job in corporate finance for a while before I got to doing that. But, you know, then I did, and I started writing literary fiction. And a lot of my literary fiction drew on, I guess, two main themes. One was, I guess, heritage and roots. My mum's from Bangladesh, my dad's from Pakistan, and those sort of messages and stories from my mother's childhood, from my dad's childhood, I guess, kind of inform and enrich a lot of my literary storytelling. And also stories of medicine, because I always wanted to be a doctor. It wasn't possible when I was much younger for complicated reasons. And so I kind of put all my medical frustration into my books by writing about different kind of diseases or issues or medical issues, even something as straightforward as, you know, the aging process and how that changes your identity, about fertility and how that affects your relationship with your children, about things like bipolar disorder and so on, and autism. And so those are the books that I was writing. And our question was, why children's fiction?
Yes.
And I think for me, it was having children that made me realize that my whole work as a novelist was invisible to my children. It meant nothing to them. When they saw my books in a library, they weren't books that they would pick up and read. They didn't have any pictures, they weren't adventures. And I realized I wasn't writing the type of books that would inspire my children in the way that I'd been inspired. And I began to realize about 6 literary novels in that the books that we read as children are the ones that really inspire and shape us. And I felt this urge to try and do something for my children, for the younger me, to try and be part of that narrative and try and write something that I would have really wanted to read. And it took me, my journey into children's writing was much longer than yours. I wrote something like 1,000 pages of unpublished children's fiction.
Oh,
I wrote
fantastic.
5 books that were about 40,000 words long each before I managed to write this series for OUP that got accepted and published. It's really, I mean, I think it's really hard writing in children's fiction because people think it's easy because they're shorter, but it's harder because every word counts. So that was a long journey for me, and I was so proud to actually finally get something that I guess brought together those themes that have always been throughout my writing, the acknowledgement of the richness of heritage. So my characters are, you know, Pakistani girls living in Britain, and also my interest in medicine. So for these are, my characters are children who want to be medics, who are really interested in the body, and who create a mystery out of it. So my series is called The Double Detectives Medical Mysteries, where you find clues. And I think medicine is very much about finding the clues until you work out how you can help someone.
And I like that you said that there were Pakistani girls, because I think that's one of the things that I had in mind when I was reading was we grew up on Enid Blyton's and reading about all kinds of mosses and lichens, which I pronounced as mosses and lichens as a child, because these were not plants or characters that we ever expected to meet in real life. And I think I have a friend who's raising her son in England right now. She said all the characters are George and Tom and, like the famous five. And it'll be nice to have a Hussein or a Hina. And that's what my stories have, is they have names that I want children who are reading here to be inspired by. That a book is not something that refers to a world that you don't have access to, though my books are all magical, so there is that lack of access in that sense. But I want them to relate to the characters, and I think naming them, giving them Pakistani names, and the new book, it's again a magical world where the rivers meet, but it's based on the Panjnath, which is where the 5 rivers of meet and become the river Indus. And they have blind dolphins and Hilsa Shad and Chinkaras and Bara Singas. And somebody read it and says very famous 5 meets the Narnia Chronicles, but with a sort of a very local flavor. And I was like, well, I guess those are the books that shaped my reading when I was younger, but I wanted it to have a local flavor. Because I think it does inspire you. Books do inspire you when you're young. And if you can relate to them, I think that's a great theme to have in a book also, to reach out to a different audience.
Yeah, and I think it's not just about being the first to do that. You want it to carry on. So when I published these books, the first one came out very early in 2020. I think I can say with confidence they were the first books that I'd seen in the UK that featured 2 brown girls on the cover. And after that, a whole kind of detective subgenre of brown girl detectives was launching, and I think it really helped that we weren't the only ones, that having my books out there supported other writers to write more girl detective stories and other stories. And so now there are actually, there are whole shelves which actually have lots of female characters that look like this. And it's not easy actually. In the UK, I remember being told that actually having children of colour might affect sales on the cover, and that's why for many writers of colour who have written really excellent children's stories, the covers either don't feature the character showing their colour, they might be in multicoloured or as a silhouette, or they kind of do it in a slightly different way. And my publishing house and myself and my agent were absolutely adamant that they weren't going to do that. They had to really represent right on the cover. It's not enough to have it hidden in the pages, right on the cover who my characters were, and then in the pages you actually, learn a little bit more about, the food we eat, what we do. You learn to walk in other people's shoes a little bit, and then it encourages more people to do that.
And the girls, I noticed, and I write about boys and girls too, but girl detectives, we all thought we were young detectives. And you're right, you said that you're writing about medical stuff so that the children want to grow up to be scientists. But through reading, I would imagine they'd want to enter that world of medicine. And that's really, it is like part of education that you want to sell science to young students, and especially to girls, because that's how they will, that will influence their careers later on in life. And I was telling you earlier that I just loved medicine when I was younger because of this pop-up book a friend gave me, which had the heart that popped up, and you pulled a lever and the valve sort of moved, and it was just the best book. And I just loved doing dissections in A-level biology because of this one book I read that I saw as a young child, maybe 9 or 10 years old.
And you went on to teach physics, so it clearly had an effect on you.
So didn't have the stomach for medicine because, like my mother, I was very squeamish, and maybe not, I never knew what I wanted to do when I was a young child. But it was inspirational, and I think books do inspire children to become something because of what they read.
Yeah, and I think, when I was writing these books, I really wanted to encourage, girls as young as 8 years old to think about the sciences and medicine as something that was attainable and not just something that's available to the few. I wanted to be a doctor when I was very young, and it wasn't possible because I was stronger in the arts, I was encouraged in the arts, I had a very literary family. And so I went down a different route. I did arts A-levels, I did PPE at Oxford, and with that you don't really go and become a doctor. And my hope, I think, when I was writing these books, and it was something that I started developing when I was in med school, was that it tells you, yes, you can be. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be, a straight A student in and be perfect in your biology or know your Krebs cycle and do all these kind of complicated things to be a doctor. You just have to turn up, do your lessons, study, and and really just care about your patients, and you can get there. So it's a message I wanted to show, was that for those who are curious, for those who are interested in solving the mystery of our body and the mystery of our maladies, that you can get there. So that was a big motivation for me in writing those books.
Yes, I think you're very motivational in that you became a doctor at a much later stage. Most people feel that if by 16 you haven't done O-level biology or chemistry or physics, you're done for, and you've sort of proved everyone that you can start whenever.
Exactly. I mean, at the time, they didn't think I could even do science A-levels, and so that's why I did A-levels in the arts. But actually, when I entered med school, I self-studied A-levels in biology, physics, and chemistry. And then I went straight into doing the graduate entry exam for medicine, which is you sit with all the science grads. And I scored top 3% in the country. So, if you study, you can do it.
Yes.
But I want to hear more about the themes of your books. Because you've got some really kind of interesting and really relevant contemporary themes.
So the books initially started off with themes of friendships. So there was the snake who everyone was scared of because he was a snake. He was this mud-colored snake. And he thought if he was beautiful, people would like him. So a fairy even came and turned him into a blue and purple snake. And he was gorgeous, but everyone was still scared of him. And he realized that this image is everything is rubbish, and I have to win people over with my heart. And when the animals in the forest saw what a good snake he was, he won them over, and he became this babysitter for all these squirrels. And this theme of loneliness, and I think when you're a child, I remember that in school, if you have one best friend, that's a lot. It's a great thing, but a lot of times when you're a child, you also feel like, I need to be popular, I need to have all the friends. And there's some children who have like 10 friends, but they want that one best friend. Friendship is like a very strong theme and in schools. And I remember that as a child. So that was a theme that came through in all my stories. There are children who, they go through phases of loneliness, but either they find their niche with a friend or many friends, it varies. And by the time I came to the last book, I had been teaching geography at primary level about rivers. And there was this wonderful book called Where the River Ran Wild, which was about cleaning up a river. And I wrote this story about a year later. And because I was writing about talking fish and talking animals by the river, that themes of ecology came through, of how you have to look after your environment. And there are things like the Hobara bustard and these Siberian white cranes. And when I was writing the book, there were probably like 20,000 of these cranes that fly through Pakistan, and now they're dwindled down to 2,000. So the idea of preservation, conservation of nature, of the river, cleaning up the river, it comes through in this story very strongly. So I think stories can be used to send across a message. You don't want to hit out a message and say, by having little taglines. But I think a story should, at the end of the day, you come out with some sort of learning experience.
Yeah, and I think that, the themes that you talk about, for example, environmentalism, it's lightly worn when it's worn in a story, which makes it so much more powerful, I think, if it's wrapped in that narrative. And the stories about difference, for example, about the snake trying to change his color to fit in. I mean, I think these are all really relevant to children today.
Yes.
And friendship, we were talking earlier about how for the age range we write for, kind of say the 8 to 12 years old, friendship is what really holds these books together. And I think it's so important in childhood because it's how we're knotted into our worlds, those relationships with our peers.
Would you like to read a little bit from one of your books?
Okay, I thought if you want to, you can start.
No, go ahead. I don't mind. Do you want to start? Would you like?
Sure.
Because we should leave some time for.
All right. So I've brought 2 books from my series. This is A Cure for a Crime, Double Detectives Medical Mysteries, first story, which I quite presciently wrote about a sinister creeping infection that was spreading around before I guess, COVID and everything happened. And in this, I'm just going to read a little section which shows how the girls, whose mum is a neurosurgeon, actually managed to handle an emergency just with a little bit of knowledge they picked up from their mum. So in this part of the story, my twins, Alia and Tulip, have snuck off away from school because they're worried that their mum might have caught some sinister infection, and so they're going to her hospital to investigate. So they've sneaked away and got a train together. My heroines are 10 years old. As they stepped off the train, a woman right behind them collapsed to the floor. Ali and Tulip looked around. Everyone else looked somewhere else, like they were trying hard not to notice the woman on the ground so they could get on with their day. "Is there a doctor here?" yelled Ali into the swarming crowd. Nothing. "A nurse? A paramedic?" yelled Tulip insistently. No one answered them. They were just little girls in school uniform. They were just little girls in school uniform, but they knew what to do. Ali and Tulip had seen their mum do this lots of times. When Nan couldn't babysit and Amma was on call in the night, they'd had to go into hospital with her. They knew their way around A&E blindfolded. They knew where the secret biscuit drawer was too. Tulip ran back towards a lady and knelt beside her. "Clear a space," she yelled crossly, to the suits swooping past, to the trainers pattering and the heels clicking. "You'll trample her." "Can you hear me? What's your name?" bellowed Ali in the lady's ear. She didn't reply. "Sorry," said Ali, and she pinched the woman hard between her neck and her shoulders. That's called a trapezius pinch, by the way. And the poor floppy woman didn't even try to swat her away. "No response to voice," said Ali. "No response to pain." "No," said Tulip, "that's bad." She looked around wildly. The crowd had cleared a bit since the train had moved off. She spotted a station manager. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "She needs an ambulance." The station manager nodded, sweating in the heat, and was already on his phone. And she and Ali counted together. 1, 2, 3. And on 3, they turned the lady into the recovery position. "Let's do the ABC," said Tulip urgently. "A for airway," said Ali. "It's patent. There's no blockage," confirmed Tulip. She shone her phone light into the sagging mouth. "B for breathing." "She is breathing," nodded Ali, watching the woman's chest rise and fall. "C for circulation." "I can feel a decent pulse," said Tulip, holding the lady's hand. "Maybe there's a clue in her handbag." She rummaged delicately through it with her fingertips. "Oh, honestly," said Ali, "are you looking for a lace hanky, your ladyship?" She grabbed the handbag, yanked it open, and dumped it on the contents on the station floor. "She's diabetic," said Tulip, spotting the insulin kit among the usual handbag guff and fluff. "D, E, F, G. Don't ever forget glucose." She grabbed a tube of sugar gel and squeezed it into the woman's mouth. The woman's eyes started flickering. She seemed to be coming round. The paramedics came racing down the stairs. "We think she had a hypo," said Ali to them. "We've given her this," and she held up the empty tube. "Well done, girls," said the paramedic. "Is this your mum? We'll look after her." The crowd who'd remained were giving Ali and Tulip a round of applause. No," said Tulip, tidying the things back in the handbag. Look, we're just heading off." "But who are you with?" said the station manager. "Are you on your own?" They looked desperately around, and then they heard a familiar hum of wheels on the platform. "No, of course they're not on their own," said Nanu. "They're with me." She was smiling sweetly at the station manager and the paramedics. "Sorry I was a bit slow. I've got a wheelchair. You know how it is." Nanu's smile flicked off like a switch when her eyes fell on the twins. She skewered them with a look of steel. "Come along, girls," she said, and her voice was like steel too. Ali and Tulip looked at each other. It was a silent conversation. They agreed with a subtle head dip that there wasn't anything else they could do. The station manager was staring at them. "Yes, Nan," they said meekly. And in this book, when there's a medical section like that, I have an appendix. So check the appendix for the Mini Medics blog post, which is what Tulip, the character, writes. Emergency to intervention, you start with ABCs, or what to do when someone's collapsed. And then you could go to the appendix at the back and learn a little bit more about the condition and what to do in an emergency. So that's just a little taste of my medical series.
That's lovely. So I think I'll just read a little bit from Where the Rivers Meet. Where the rivers meet, there's a magical, the vortex of magic. And every child growing up by the river knows about the vortex of magic, where fish can talk and people can breathe underwater, because the fishermen have told them all these stories. And Tanya and Hassan have grown up by the river, and they've gone up north to meet, where they run into Seemal and Masood, who've come from abroad, and Masood just does not buy these stories. He says, it's not true. And Tanya's like, are you calling the fisherman and my parents a liar? And he's like, I'm not saying that, it's just, why is this not mentioned in geography books? So they have a bit of a fight. And the next day, all 4 children tried to act as if nothing had happened. But Tanya was still hurt and angry, and she found it difficult to talk too much to Masood. She put on her best act to be cordial with him. I'm sorry if I upset you, said Masood gently. It's fine. Why don't we go to our place and get some breakfast? Hassan and Tanya's parents were already at the breakfast table. Hassan's father was reading the newspaper when the children walked in. What's up? Said Hassan. You look so serious. There's been a terrible earthquake in the northern region. So many people have lost their lives and their homes. Some towns have been reduced to rubble. It's all too ghastly to speak of. Hassan and Tanya's parents were discussing the possibility of going north to help out the local people of the area. They left the dining table to make calls to find out how they could help. The children finished eating their breakfast when Hassan suggested they race their bikes down to the river. Tanya shrugged her shoulders and said she would rather walk. I'm tired of racing too, said Seemal. It's not like I ever win. She's the youngest of the lot. So why don't we both walk together? So the 4 children split up and headed to the river through different routes. When Seemal and Tanya reached the river, the boys were cycling quite far ahead of them. Tanya looked over to the river and saw sailboats coming towards them. Look, it's the fisherman, she said, turning around to tell Seemal. But Seemal was nowhere to be seen. In one split second, she had disappeared. Seemal, Seemal, shouted Tanya, cupping her hands in front of her mouth. But no matter how long she shouted, there was no response from Seemal. Tanya looked over to where the boys were. They were turning round and slowly coming towards her as they cycled. Tanya shouted out to them and gestured to them to hurry up as she ran towards them. I can't find Seemal, she called out. What do you mean you can't find Seemal? She was with you, said Masood. I turned to look at the river boats for 1 second, and when I turned round, she was gone. It was clearly more than 1 second. Are you calling me a liar now? I really am beginning to hate you. And so they split up to go and look for Seemal. And Tanya's walking along the river. The others have gone back home. And she runs into the fisherman. And the fisherman, Captain Dildar, says, come onto the boat. This is an area of magic and anything weird can happen around here. So Tanya was beginning to feel sick with worry as the boat moved along the river's edge. Now she's looking for Seemal with the captain. She was peering over through the binoculars when the boat started to move away from the river's edge. Where are we going? That's strange. It's almost as if a current is pulling us to the center of the river. Except the river doesn't behave like this. Let's see if we can steer the boat back, said Dildar. Just then the sky, which had been bright blue, started to darken, and within seconds it was as black as night. This is impossible, said Captain Dildar, but he and his crew were prepared for all weather. Despite their amazement, they knew exactly what to do, and soon everyone was huddled under the floorboards of the boat. It was hot and stifling there, and Tanya felt like she couldn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, Captain Dildar opened the boards to go up and check the boat. Unknown to him, Tanya followed. She just needed a breath of cool, fresh air. Once on the deck, she found it hard to keep her balance as the boat was being tossed around like a basket in the sea. One side rose higher than the other, and soon she was knocked off her feet. She screamed as she toppled over. She saw Captain Dildar turn round and look towards her, his mouth open in horror as the girl in his charge fell overboard. So she's fallen overboard and he's jumped in after her. But as he's holding on to the rope that was fastened at one end to the boat, the water kept pushing him away from Tanya. He was swirling outwards as Tanya was swirling inwards. Just then she saw the fin of a dolphin coming towards her at full speed. Reaching out, she grabbed its fins. She was underwater and her lungs were burning as if she was running out of air. Eventually she had no choice but to open her mouth, and to her surprise she felt air rush in instead of water. She was caught in the whirlpool and could breathe. She was in the vortex of magic. So quite different.
We thought we'd talk a little bit about the power and the use of illustration in children's fiction as well, because obviously for children, and again the age group that we write for is 12 and under, so before you get to the teen and the young adult fiction, image is very important. Saman's got some beautifully illustrated books there.
Yeah. So my first two books are very illustrated books. And it's interesting, illustrations reach out. I think when I show the illustrations, sort of, there's a lovely one of this, the snake, the blue snake, and the elephant falling in the water. And I know a lot of adults look at the books and they love the illustrations. And, but I noticed it does actually change children's perceptions of books also. Because as soon as people see these books, it's like, oh, they're for like 5, 6-year-olds. And I'm like, no, I think the message in the wording is for slightly older books. And even in school, my children say, oh, those are for class 3 and 4. But even though if they read it in 5 and 6, they're like, oh, actually, I really enjoyed the story. So then when I wanted to reach for an older audience, I went for a book with no pictures in it. And then I actually regretted that, because I was looking at How to Train Your Dragon, the story of it. And it's got these lovely black and white little etching-like pictures in it, which I think really lift the story up. So I think even if it is a short novel, or even the Michael Mopogo, there's a Casper the Cat, and I read that, and there were lovely black and white illustrations. So interesting that as adults we feel a book should have no illustrations, and children also my students feel that they're too grown up for the picture books. But I think some amount of illustration, it really, it livens up the story. And when I write, I have like an image in my mind. Because I think maybe because I'm an artist also, I know exactly what the setting looks like. And when I see a picture of it, it just brings that story to life for me. How do you feel about it? Because are your books illustrated?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's slightly different because for these books, it was very much about the cover art. And we worked with an excellent artist called Mike Lowry, who's Oxford-based and who's done stuff for Oxford University Press before. And we gave him quite a kind of a good brief. And actually, when I saw the original drawings that he did, I think because in this case, the words come first, and it illustrates it's less of a partnership, but more taking the lead from the writer. I felt actually quite comfortable giving some feedback, and my twin daughters, because the characters in this book are based on my twin girls, actually did some poses for both of these covers, and I took selfies and photos and sent them in, because I really wanted to get, to capture, a little bit of the cheekiness and, and the positions and how they interacted. So, for example, in this one, they're holding hands, because I thought that was quite important. One of the drafts that Mike Lowry did had them sort of doing kung fu, aggressive poses, which might be fit for certain books, but this one was about sisterhood and being there for each other, even when you're getting on each other's nerves, because you've got a common goal. So I think, and it was a few drafts to get, the right kind of cover. But once we've done that, and, they even did the cat, which is quite nice, I actually think some illustration is important, but because I was aware that for Oxford University Press it was going to be education, where we put it was actually in the blog and the appendix at the end to really illustrate the medical sections. So let me see. So, for example, a section on the different bits of the brain and what they do, and Oh, let me find. And in this book, I've got some others as well. This is the Bristol stool chart for the section, What Does Your Poo Say About You, for when they've got food poisoning. And so that talks about those sorts of things. And again, quite presciently, because I was writing about a mystery virus that was affecting the school, there's a section on hand washing that came out actually exactly this, early 2020, which was a really useful section for children to have in their books actually once COVID started hitting. So I kind of liked using those sorts of illustrations. But for my next set of books that are coming out, these are more kind of non-fiction based on the body. It's a set of 4 books about our brilliant bodies. So it's about my brilliant brain, my super skeleton, my glorious gut, and my hero heart. These are all going to be very heavily illustrated, where the words will be in a partnership with the illustrator, because it's about learning about different sections of the body and what they do. A little bit like the book that inspired Saman when she was younger about the body. And so in that, we're very much working together, where I'm producing maybe 4,000 words of text, and the illustrator is coming back and providing some work against it, and we're working together in that way. And that's for a slightly younger age group, just under 8. But I think for that, the illustrations will do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the communication and engagement. So I think it does vary, but I think it is true that as you get older, the publishing expectation is that we need imaging less. But actually, as adults, I think we still really appreciate it.
Yes, and it's interesting that, and I never realized that. And I was going to, that brings me to that sort of idea of the target audience. Do you have a target audience in mind when you're writing? But did you always have your audience in mind when writing?
I guess for the literary fiction, it was readers like me. It was the sort of thing I was interested in. And when I started to try and write the children's books, I had this very easy focus group at home, because my 4 children were aged between 7 and 11 at the time when I started writing. So they were perfectly in sync in terms of the vocabulary and the experience. So they were my target audience, and also they fed me a lot of information about what was going on as well. So I actually felt I was very much in their world. So for me, it felt perfect to be writing for that audience, because I was taking my children, as I guess every parent does this, as representative of their world, their peers, and their cohort. And I think I will find it quite hard actually now that my girls, my youngest twins, have just turned 12. So they'll be moving out of this age range to actually stay kind of connected to that as well. But I think that was the audience I really wanted. And also, I guess, particularly to reach the young me, for the book that I wanted to see written, I would have, if I'd had a book like this when I was younger, or books like these, like the books that my peers are writing, or books like Saman's, perhaps I would have been, more forthright in going to perhaps do medicine early and writing alongside it. I perhaps would have taken a different path. So I think I'm writing for people who are trying to discover, what they really want to do in life, and to try and give them a way to show that it's available.
Yeah, I started off also that same idea of reaching the younger me. And I thought of the younger me, and I liked fairies. And I wrote this one story which had this girl go into this forest where there was a heartbeat tree where every species of flower grew on this tree. And it was the sort of origin of all nature. And this fairy gets her to pick out this flower, which turns out to be a flower she brings to the village of Karachi. It's the LAHORE tree. And I was teaching about 9, 10-year-old children. And I started this story, and it felt like I was on this sort of train crash I couldn't get off of. The girls' eyes were just lit up, and the boys were I was losing them. And at the end of the story, I looked at the boys and I said, "You hated that." And they were like, And the next day, some boy said to me, "Miss, you wrote that story." And the other boy said, "Which story?" I said, "The one that you didn't like." He said, "What story?" So I said, "The one with the fairy." And he said, "Let's not go there." And he's only 9 years old. And I was like, "Okay, so what should I have written about?" And they said, "Dragons." So I said, so then I started talking to these children about, I wanted feedback from them. And I realized that I was reaching out for a 9-year-old girl. And I wanted to reach out to boys and girls because that's what I teach. And then the journey sort of getting to know these children. And I found it was a really fascinating class. The 9-year-old, they said, "Can we write any color pencil?" And I'm like, "Yes." So the boys scribbled their stories down in graphite in 5 minutes, and the girls were still sharpening the color pencils. And I just didn't understand what was going on in this class. And 2 years later, those girls were completely different. They're like, I don't want to use a color pencil. So it was interesting how they grow up and how they change, and how being 9 years old is so different to being 11 years old, because that same girl that I saw with that, sharpening her pencils, and I said, do you want to use a color pencil? And she said, why would I want to? And I said, okay, I haven't grown up with you enough. So I started reading books and started talking to the children. And this one it starts off with this 10-foot snakefish. I didn't put in a dragon, but the snakefish actually exists in the Indus. And it's this fish with like very sharp teeth, which can actually wriggle onto the land and survive for 2-3 days in muddy waters as long as it's raining or something like that. So I found that I had to learn through children what their interests were and try and move away from writing for myself. Initially, you'll see, I think this book has so many big words, and it has a lot of alliterations and things like that in it. So it's quite different. But again, the stories, like it was, the elephant was amazed, he stared, he goggled as his mind boggled. Was this true? Could a snake be blue? So there was a lot of rhythm and rhyme, because I love Dr. Seuss books. So I was just trying to remember what I liked. And then I had to try and develop something that was a little more neutral and a little bit away from myself. So it was a different journey.
Yeah, I think getting, the way you're describing it, getting the voice right for children is actually really, really challenging. I don't think people are quite aware of how hard it is. Like I said, I wrote 1,000 pages before I got the voice right. And I think probably my previous writing of literary fiction did me a disservice, because if you thought you were writing long or writing with complicated words, I was doing it twice as badly. For children's fiction of this age, you really don't want to go above 40,000 words, and the first draft of this book was like 70,000 words. So I pretty much had to cut a third of it and make it more relatable and get the voice absolutely right. So that that's a challenge.
And like I said, a 9-year-old is very different to an 11-year-old.
Oh, absolutely.
So when you're reaching out it's like if you're reaching out for a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old, you probably get the sort of a range of audience, but it's very specific with children, what they like and don't like and how they grow up so fast.
No, it's quite a magical time to write for, actually, but it's true that just even an extra few months of age lends immeasurable sophistication to a child who's got someone who's a sibling just slightly, or a friend just a few months older, and they will carry that with them. That person will always be just those few months older.
Yes, they're not 4 years old, they're 4.5 years old, and half is very, very important to them. And then now I realize that developmentally that half a year makes a lot of difference.
And what do you think? we talked a little bit about the importance of children's writing and about the importance of narrative for children. Do you have any kind of thoughts about, how important it is in terms of, storytelling, the act of reading in terms of children's development? Even as a teacher.
Yes, I think, I was telling you earlier that COVID had such a negative effect on students. We realized we were online for 20 months, and when we came back, they had regressed in a lot of ways, and in one of them was in their writing skills. Because in school there's a library, and once a week they take out one fiction book in English, one in Urdu, one non-fiction book. And most of them do read, not all of them. Some are like, horses at that watering hole. But you realize that by having an access to a library, a lot of them were reading a lot more. Because it doesn't always we think reading comes from the home, but actually not all homes are reading centric. So it does make a lot of difference to how children are reading, and then how they're writing, how they're analyzing, their comprehension. Everything got affected because, and I think, there was also like social development, that's a totally different topic. But there was a big gap, an academic gap that these 20 months online created. And I do feel it's because children were reading less.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a really interesting fact that I learned in medical school was that the very best thing you can do for a child's health, both physical and mental health, is read to them for an early age for half an hour a day. That is the best thing you can do to encourage that child will live a long life, and not just in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health. Because encouraging literacy and appreciation of story at that age encourages empathy, encourages good decision making, encourages independence of thought and initiative. So the child who is read to at an early age, or who reads for a little bit every day, will not be someone who is making bad decisions in their 20s, or someone who is making bad health decisions in their 50s and 60s. I found it really fascinating, the longitudinal research on that. And sometimes, I guess during the pandemic, it's been easy to sometimes dismiss a little bit the work in the arts and storytelling. We saw this as, you know, parents during the pandemic spending less time on reading stories and more time on just trying to get stuff done, which we all appreciate. But I think one thing I've learned, being on both sides of being both a doctor and a creative artist, is that yes, you know, doctors, we save lives, but the arts are what makes life worth living. This is what is really important to us in terms of learning about each other, reflecting our lives upon other people, and, I'm not sure that feedback is me, and learning to walk in each other's shoes. This empathy, this storytelling, this is what saves lives and stops wars and what keeps us connected, I guess.
Yes. So I'm wondering, do we need to open the floor to questions?
Yeah, I think
we've got 15 minutes. Does anyone have any questions over here?
Yeah. So, yeah, if anyone's got some questions.
Lovely, there's some questions in the back. Sure. Sorry, I think the mic's not on.
Hello. Okay, so I'd like to ask this to both of you. What does your writing process look like? Like, what do you do before, and do you set time aside for it? Do you have to be alone for it? And what does the environment look like? Everything. What is the process?
The process.
The writing process. When you start writing a book, or
I think that's a very good question for Roopa, because as a doctor, I don't know how you get time for writing. That's
I guess this is a question I get asked a lot, actually, because I also teach creative writing and literature as well. I teach at Oxford currently, and before I was teaching at a different university. And for me, I think the important thing in terms of writing process, if you want to be a writer, is to just spend a little bit of time every day practicing that craft. So if you can carve out even just an hour for yourself every day to write, even if you haven't got a strong story at that time, you'll find yourself developing the stories that you want to tell. And even if you are just writing what we call morning pages or something that isn't particularly focused, that is how you develop your writing, and then you can start to think about the story that you really want to tell. In terms of writing something long, like a novel or a short story, I think for me the key thing for someone who wants to practice in the arts in this way is to find a story that only you can tell. Find something that is true to you, that is sincere, and then you will find it is easy to write about because it is something that you believe. So I think for me there's two elements to that. One is what inspires you, what gets you up in the morning, what keeps you awake at night, what are the things you really care about, because those should probably be the focus of your writing. That's at least what worked for me. I appreciate I'm not a commercial storyteller, so I don't write detective series or series like that where they have a slightly different motivation, but that's what works for me. And also create a little bit of time in your day, carve it out, even if it's getting up half an hour early or going to bed half an hour later, just to write. People always ask me how I've actually published more than my Oxford colleagues in the last 2 years during the pandemic by publishing a book a year, which kind of slightly surprised them. But actually, it's only because I write a little, but I write it every day. So even if it's only like 250 to 500 words, I might just get up an hour earlier and just get that done, or work on it late at night after my shift. But that's how, you get to it. Not all those words are publishable by any means, but that's how you keep going.
Yeah, I find, but summer holidays are great for me because I'm a teacher, so I get a lot of time in the summer. winter not so much. But even the Where the Rivers Meet was written during the term because I saw this competition I wanted to join. And I literally used to find 15, 20 minutes every day and write. And I got the work, it was done in about 3-4 months. Half of it was chopped up and changed, but the fact is that the first draft, I was able to do just writing 20 minutes a day. It was as productive as writing, over the longer periods during the summer break. So I think it was a more healthy way of writing also in a way, because I used to think of something, then I could come back to it, change it. But yes, when I showed it to a friend, she sort of gave me some feedback, and I sort of chopped it up and changed it quite a bit after that, and it went through quite a few drafts. So, yeah. Now there's a question at the back, I think.
Hello, can you
Yes.
hear me? Yeah, so my question is related to the sales of these children's books, because I have also written one book for children, empowering females as role models. But I mean, we have just published 20 to 30 copies of that book. How, do you make your living by writing, if you do, by writing for children? And I would like to know how many copies are sold generally.
$1 million question. To be honest, I was, for about 10 years, I was earning my living only from writing, which is when I was a mother to very young children. So until when my children were under 5, all 4 of them, for about 10 years, I was writing, I was earning just from writing books. And to be honest, the only way of doing that was by writing a book a year, and being sure that if you weren't writing a book a year, you were at least publishing a book a year. So I've published 7 literary pieces and these 2 children's books, but I've actually written 8 other books in between that weren't publishable. For whatever reason, they weren't considered commercial enough. The agent didn't like it, the publisher didn't want to pick it up, but I was still kept to my contract. So the only way to earn your living from writing is to write very persistently. So if you're writing fiction, you would literally have to write a book a year, which is quite hard if you're writing literary fiction like myself. If you're writing more commercial fiction, I know lots of commercial writers who have a little bit more of a structure and a kind of repetition in model, and so that's a little bit more achievable. In children's fiction, to be frank, the advances are a lot less. So if you're writing children's fiction, you'd probably have to write 3 books a year to actually make the same as an adult book. So you would have to be, it's really a job. It would really be, I write for, 1 hour, 2 hours a day, and I write alongside it to publish a book a year. But if you wanted to completely earn your living from it, it's a job. It's 9 to 5. And when you're not writing fiction, you would be presenting at schools, doing readings, earning money through that as well, and also through doing interviews and writing pieces. So I know a lot of people who do earn their living completely as a writer, but they have to take on all 3 parts of that. They have to do the public speaking and the teaching and the kind of readings in the schools, and do some of those several times a week, as well as being very persistent in being published. And so if one book isn't published, they just get on and write the next and get that published. And also in writing the pieces for the for the press and the magazines that pay, and pretty much never turning down a commission. So it's a hard graft.
Yes, I think I earn through teaching. So, yeah, I think there's a question. Is the mic? There's a question. Okay, there's a question at the back. Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. You were talking about libraries as places where you can encourage reading and then do it consistently, because it's a space dedicated for that. How, in your opinion, do you think places like libraries, places that even outside that, clubs and stuff like that, can it be taken a step further? Can you encourage more kind of community based on children's fiction, or have children come together and find more value in this place of a library?
So this is sorry, the voice was not so clear. Is this a question more about library spaces and spaces for children to discover reading?
Discover and kind of interact based on that. How are these spaces of sharing important in your opinion?
Did you get that?
Yeah. So, can I just clarify? The question was about how we how we can really use library spaces in ways to actually really kind of be interactive and kind of create. I'm sorry, I didn't actually. It breaks up a little bit, so correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, basically that.
Yeah, so that is it's very important to have libraries. I think it's and I think these literature festivals, I think there should be actually some just activities for children also, where they can come and just have or children's authors read to them. I think that would be a great space for them, because I think you need to just like trying to get them to be scientists at a young age. You want them to be readers at a young age. So we do need to sell reading more, I think, over here than we do.
And to be frank, it is children's fiction that has been keeping, at least in the UK, libraries open and bookshops open, because they are the reason that people actually walk into a bookshop, walk into a library to actually see a real copy of a book. Books like this and books like these don't work so well on a Kindle. For a child, they really want to interact with the story, and they are what's keeping in real life places like libraries and bookshops alive and open. And I think it's really, I mean, I discovered all my reading as a child in a library, and I think, to be honest, the children's section in a library and the children's section in a bookshop is the most important section, because I guess adults are increasingly finding their stories and their narratives online, and they can read from Kindles, and it's great for the environment and all of that. But I think for children, it's really important that those spaces remain alive and vibrant and welcoming. And also, it's a massive equalizer, because any child of any means, of even if they've got indifferent parents or those who can't find the time, can go into a library and discover all these stories spinning around them and find their book that speaks to them. So, some people say about their children, oh, my child's not a reader. That's not true. They just haven't found their book. They just haven't found their story. And how will you do that? And how will you do that if their home only has a certain amount of shelf space? They discover it in the library. That's where it is free and open and equal, and that's where they can find their story.
Yeah. So there's a question here?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question. How do you actually get your books published? Because it's very difficult finding a publisher.
Oh, God, yeah, really hard.
Yes,
Literally.
absolutely.
Do you want to take that one to start?
Well, over here, for me it was very difficult. So I'm published through Oxford University Press, because they do take on books. But I find I haven't been able to make inroads into UK publishers. I did try and show where the rivers meet there, but for me, it's because Oxford University Press is very much over here. They were kind enough to take on the books, but yeah, it was difficult to try and just break out there, try and get another publisher. For me, has not been an option really, but.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a hard industry to break into. I mean, there are less gatekeepers now in publishing. So if you really believe in your story, you can self-publish, you can put it out online, you can get it out in different places. But the traditional route of getting books into a big publisher has always been really hard. And to put it in context, in my med school, there are maybe 100 students, and out of those 100 students, 99 of us became doctors at the end of the course. On my Oxford course, I've got 100 students, and out of those 100 students, at the end of those 2 years, maybe only 2 or 3 of those will be published by big mainstream publishers. They will get their work out in other ways, but to be someone who is going to make their living from writing, it's really hard. For myself, for my very first book, Bittersweets, which I published 15 years ago, I remember sending out something like 100 submissions to different publishers, different agents, again and again, to get that book published. It eventually got shortlisted for a competition which brought it to the attention of Pan Macmillan, who weren't interested in the first book I'd written, but were interested in Bittersweets. And so that's how I got my foot in the door. I was what you call a slush pile writer, where you send a story, you send your chapters to the publisher, and it sits in what's called a slush pile, waiting for an intern to read and say, maybe this one's worth looking at. So it's a real message in a bottle kind of gamble. And you have to really believe in your work to persist. But if you tell the right story, it will come out. You can get it out there. But like I said, it doesn't get easier even when you're really well published. I published, I think, 6 books, and then my 7th wasn't published by the same publisher or the same agent, even though the quality of the book wasn't an issue. It was about the audience and what they thought would sell. Because if they're going to pay you a certain advance for a book, they want to believe it will get that many readers as well. And if they think it's too niche, then it won't. So there's a certain realism and a certain pragmatism as well in writing. So it is hard. And for the children's books, it was even harder because there are fewer children's publishers. So, you know, it was a great blessing to find for me to find Oxford University Press. But I'd literally submitted to pretty much every other children's publisher to get these books out there. You know, you persist, and like I say, this was the 4th set of children's books I'd actually written that actually found the publisher. The others are still sort of sitting in my virtual drawer. Maybe I'll bring them out another time.
So I think we're out of time. Or do you want one more question, or out of time?
Oh, I think one more.
Oh, there's one last question. Sure.
Okay, thank you. So congratulations to both of you for
Thank
some
you.
wonderful work. And Roopa, we're on this panel together tomorrow. I'm a doctor as well. I'm just curious, you know, sitting in Pakistan, what we see, I mean, you mentioned brown girls as characters in your book, and which is groundbreaking, I think, in terms of, you know, the acceptance and how they are going to be perceived and received. And as an outsider, it seems that brown people don't always get the most friendly reception in Britain. And I'm just wondering if that's part of the motivation behind your books, and if that is also included in your books, that aspect. You know, I mean, if you look at things like Ackley Bridge, or if you look at My Son the Fanatic, East is East, and also just what you hear, and even you work for the NHS.
Yes.
If you look at what happened in the NHS during the pandemic, you know, minority doctors were more exposed and had, you know, words out. So I'm just wondering that if that is also part of what you're writing.
I think,
yeah.
I think in a way my books are slightly ideal. I mean, in my current memoir, which is out, I write a lot about these kind of tougher issues that are facing us. I think for my books for children, it's not that I wanted to create an idealized reality, but I wanted to create an accepting reality. And I wanted to make it clear that there is a role and there is a place and there is a representation of where we are accepted and celebrating our differences. So we can really celebrate everything we share and celebrate the ways in which we're different as well. And so in my books, I try and show that. So for example, in showing an intergenerational family, where you have the grandmother picking up the pieces, if you like, because you've got a single working mum. And, you know, hospital doctors, as you know, are really busy, so you have a mother constantly feeling guilty for not doing enough for her children there. Also representing, you know, different kind of sexualities, races, different careers, and everything within the books was really important to me. So I tried hard to create a place which acknowledged there was difference and that there was bickering, but not ever even allowing for toxic banter. I wanted to create a reality where people would feel safe in these books and make it more representative.
Thank you.
Lovely,
I think
thank you.
we're out of time. I've been given the cut off.